We are in the book of Esther, but just for one more night, we're done here tonight, looking for a promise of God. I told you last night the difficulty in Esther in finding a direct promise from God is that God is never mentioned in this book. And there are a lot of people, I don't know how many, obviously. I don't know what percentage, where the percentage line falls, but there are real good Bible scholars that don't think that Esther belongs in the Holy Scriptures, in the canon, in the Bible, because God's name is not mentioned. And I'm trying to show you that if God was ever alive and well and protecting His people Israel, it's in the book of Esther. It's just so clear that the actions, the activities, the human hatred against Israel that's defeated in the time of Esther can only be the hand of Almighty God, Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So it doesn't concern me at all that His name isn't written. God is clearly here. And I'm going to offer something about why I think maybe His name is kept out of it, maybe a little later. So what does Yahweh, or how does Yahweh protect the nation of Israel during the days of Esther? That's what we're looking at. We're going to finish the story tonight, but I want to show you very quickly, don't anybody pass out. I just want to show you a brief, there's about 6 of these dates. I just want to show you a timeline to where Esther fits into the Bible. I think it has a lot to do with the message of Esther. In 586 BC, you know, Jerusalem is destroyed by Babylon under King Nebuchadnezzar. This is when the southern kingdom of Judah dies. They go out under King Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians. Jerusalem is destroyed. The temple is destroyed in 586 BC, before Christ. 586 years before Jesus comes to earth, Jerusalem is destroyed and the Jews are dispersed. They go into Babylon. 538 BC, about 50 years later, Cyrus, the king of Persia, appointed to send Jews back to the promised land to rebuild the temple. So about 50 years has gone by. God knows how long it'll take to rebuild the temple. It'll take approximately 20 years. And so on the 70th year after the Jews have left, in 515, I would have written 515, and I wrote this. I don't know why it says 16, but in late 516 BC, the temple is completed. You can see from 586 to 516, 70 years. Just exactly what Jeremiah said. Israel will be kicked out of the land for 70 years, and we see it exactly so. From the day worship stopped in Israel till the day worship was again available to Israel, 70-year period of time. You go down history a little bit further, 486 BC, so what is that, 35 years or so? You have a king named Xerxes, a Persian king. Ahasuerus is what he's called in the book of Esther. It's King Xerxes. If you read a non-Bible history, you'll see him as Xerxes, not Artaxerxes. He comes later, but Xerxes is this king, the one who married Esther. 486 BC, Ahasuerus, I'll call him that because that's what he's called in the Bible, he becomes the king of Persia. By 479 BC, what is that, 7 years later or so? Esther becomes the queen of Persia because she marries Xerxes, Ahasuerus. We're running very close to the end of the time when God would speak to Israel through the prophets. Remember in the book of Amos, chapter 8, verse 11, God tells Israel there's a day coming, there's a famine coming to the land of Israel. Not a famine for food or water, but a famine for the word of God. I am going to go silent because you don't want it. I've sent prophet after prophet to you, and God tells Israel in the book of Amos, He prophesies that He is going to go silent, and we know that He was silent for just over 400 years. No writing, no description of prophets in the land doing their work. Thus saith the Lord. There's a silent period between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the writings of the New Testament. So this occurs right before God goes silent, very close to the writing of the book of Malachi, the last writings of the book of Nehemiah when God says, that's it. You're not going to hear from me again until you hear from me. I'm going to go silent. So the book of Esther, if you want what Esther covers, it covers a 10-year period of time. From 483 to 473, remember it says Ahasuerus becomes king in 486. You read in the beginning verses of Esther that in this year of the king, these things occurred. It starts in 483 BC and it ends in 473 with the Feast of Purim, Purim, with the Jews being saved from the wicked Haman. So it covers a 10-year period of Jewish history. So these are the parties involved, just to get us back up to speed. Or let me say this before I say that, about the idea that God is about to go silent. I love the fact that the book of Esther and this remnant of Israel, these there are obedient Jews still in the kingdom of Israel among the 12 tribes. I love the fact that this story is where it is in human history, in the history of Israel. Because I think it's a story where God is teaching a great lesson to Israel about the fact that even though you don't hear me or hear from me, like the book of Esther that doesn't say my name, I will always be the king of Israel. You will always be my chosen people. There will be restoration coming. And I love the story of Esther. God shows some of his most intimate care to Israel in the book of Esther, even though he's unnamed. And I can see it as this preface to his silence. Even when my name, even when it appears as if I'm not involved, I'm intimately involved in the lives of my people, Israel. They needed this type of encouragement going into the silent years. So even though he seems to not be personally involved in this book because the author didn't put his name in it, he is no doubt intimately involved as the protector, the mother bear, if you will, protecting her cubs called Israel. And the book of Esther will show that as we look at it here. So we have a couple of players, 3 players in particular. When we get into the story proper, we have wicked Haman, a Gentile, a man of the Persian Empire, very high in rank. And Haman has talked King Ahasuerus into making a decree that on the 13th day of the 12th month, every living Jew will be killed. On the 13th day of the 12th month, we will kill them all. He has a great hatred for Esther's relative Mordecai. And because of that, he wants all the Jews killed. He talks the king into issuing a decree. And remember what I said, in this empire, when a king makes a law, it can't be reversed. It can't be annulled. Once it's written down, it's law. And so something had to happen. God had to choose a different way to save Israel here, because on the books, it showed that in the 12th month, on the 13th day, there will be a slaughter, and every man, woman, everybody can turn on their neighbor who is Jewish and kill them without cause. If they're Jewish, on this day, they die. Can you imagine that? I wonder how many nations would pass that law today if they could get away with it. You think there's any? Oh, you better believe there's a lot of them. A lot of them. Mordecai tells Esther this: we are doomed. From human viewpoint, our people, the 12 tribes of Israel, we're finished. But not from God's viewpoint. And what Mordecai says to his relative Esther is, Esther, you are royalty. You're the wife of this man, King Ahasuerus. You might be able to do something about this. You might be able, God may have raised you up to do something about this. He says in Esther 4, verse 14, this is Mordecai, a Jew, telling the queen, a Jew, who are sentenced to death on a certain date. He says, for if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. I love that statement. Mordecai knows we are God's people. God made eternal promises to Israel. I don't know how he's going to solve this, but he's done it before. He did it at the Red Sea when the Egyptians were marching on. He's done it over and over. God will fix this. But Esther, don't you want to be a part of this if you can be? Don't you want to be the hands and feet of the Lord now? Don't you want to do your part? He says deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish. And who knows, he says, Mordecai to his relative, who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this. Now, is Yahweh involved? I'll tell you in just a minute what the word for royalty means, but you know what it is. It's authority, it's royal authority, it's bloodline authority. In this case, it's by marriage. But someone has made Esther the queen of the Persian Empire. She's married to the strongest man on earth. And my question is God involved in this? Is God involved in Esther becoming royalty, the queen, at this particular time in human history? What's the answer to that question? What's the answer to it? Can you answer it biblically? If I said, prove to me in the Bible that God is in control and God had a hand in Esther becoming royal family in Persia, prove it. How would you start to prove it? What would be your mindset? Where would you go to prove it? Number one, somewhere in this book, that God is in charge of raising kings and royalty and putting kings and royalty down. That's what you have to know. She is royalty. And Mordecai says, who knows whether you have attained royalty for such a time as this? God may have elevated you to this position. And we see from the scriptures that he very much is in charge of raising up kings and deposing kings. It's God's business. In this verse, 1 Kings chapter 14, verse 14, we see Jewish kings. We see Jewish kings being raised by God. It says, moreover, Yahweh, the Lord, will raise up for himself a king over Israel, who will cut off the house of Jeroboam this day and from now on. This is just after the northern and the southern kingdoms is split, 931 BC or so. Jeroboam is absolutely hideous as a king, the worst ever in the north. He's the first northern king and the worst there ever was, even worse than Ahab. This man is horrible. And God will raise up a king to depose Jeroboam and kill all of Jeroboam's people, all of his sons, so that they'll never come to the throne. But what does it say about who's in charge of raising the king? It very clearly puts all the onus on the Lord for doing that. Yahweh is in charge. It's his prerogative. He chooses who he will raise up for himself as king of Israel. He gets to choose that, and only him. Look at this verse, Jeremiah 23, verse 5 and 6. Tell me who this king is that God will raise. Behold, the days are coming, declares Yahweh. So God the Father speaks these things. Behold, the days are coming when I will raise up. Who's in charge of raising royalty to their positions? God is. We vote, but God's in charge. God is ultimately in charge of how everything goes in this realm. He selects the kings. He says, behold, the days are coming when I will raise up for David a righteous branch. So this king that God is speaking of will come from David's family, David the king, not Saul, but David. I'll raise up for David a righteous branch, and he will reign as king and act wisely and do justice and righteousness in the land. What's his name? What's his name? His name is Jesus, Jesus of Nazareth. In his days, Judah will be saved, and all Israel will dwell securely. Are they dwelling securely right now, or are rockets being shot at them from every corner of the globe, it seems? But when Jesus reigns as the king of Israel one day, Israel will dwell securely. And this is one of the greatest verses to use when anybody comes to your door, whether Jehovah's Witnesses or the Mormon Well, they are, the JWs are the Mormons. They come to your door with their false belief that Jesus is not God. That can't be so. Because in Jeremiah 23, verse 5, God the Father speaks and it calls him Yahweh. And God the Father, Yahweh, says that one day I will raise up a king, a Jewish king, and in his days Judah will be saved. And this is what this king will be known as on earth. This is his name. Remember who's speaking, the Father. This is his name, the king, the human king from David's branch, by which he will be called Yahweh Sidkenu, the Lord our righteousness. God the Father calls the king God. We've already identified the king as Jesus. So is Jesus God? From Jeremiah 23, chapter 5, or chapter 23, verse 5 and 6, there is no other way. There's no way around this verse. I've seen the dance of these people at the door when I've given them this verse because they don't know what to do with that. It's the best verse, I think, in the entire Bible to prove without question, it's not men speaking, it's God speaking about God the Son. It's God the Father speaking about the Son Jesus, Yeshua, who will come, and he shares his name with the King that will come. Yeshua or Yahweh says that Yahweh is coming. Has to be a God. Has to be the God of heaven. So not only does God choose Jewish kings, but God will choose and has chosen Messiah, the King of Kings. And what about the Gentile kings? In Daniel 2, verse 21, because we're talking about Gentile nation here. We're talking about the Persian Empire. Are they outside of God's jurisdiction, or does he also choose there? In Daniel 2:21, it says, it is he, speaking of God, who changes the times and the epochs. He removes kings and establishes kings. Who's in charge of these things? God is. So who's in charge then of Esther becoming the queen of the Persian Empire? God is. They say he's not in this book. I can't almost read a verse without tripping over God's appearance in this book. God chose this. Mordecai understand it. Perhaps it's for such a time as this that you have been set up. One more, Psalm 110 verse 5 says, the Lord is at your right hand. He will shatter kings in the day of his wrath. Not only does he install kings, he decides when time is up. The Lord is at your right hand, and he will shatter kings in the day of his wrath. And we're about to see him shatter, not a king, but a wicked man named Haman, who is very high in the palace. The Lord will shatter this satanic push to kill all Israel. So even though God's name is not written in the book of Esther, Yahweh is the only one who establishes kings. He's the only one who establishes royalty, and he's the only one who can remove kings and remove royalty. Look at the verse again. Mordecai understands it. He says, for if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. And you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have attained royalty for such a time as this, reminding her that even though you're the queen, you're a Jew. And you will be killed on the 13th day of the 12th month if you don't gain courage and go in and do something about this. Royalty is the Hebrew word malkut, M-A-L-K-U-T, and it means royal authority or the dominion of a monarch. The dominion of a monarch. So he is telling her, you have royal authority and the dominion as a monarch. You are a king. The word for king is melech. The word for royalty is malkut. They're almost the same word. Melech and malkut. M-L-K. So he's lifting her up and trying to gain her confidence. So what happens in the book of Esther? Now I've prefaced it all. Let's look at the book and see what happens. Just a few verses tonight. Esther 7, verse 3 through 4. The stage is set. The Jews are all going to be killed on the 13th day of the 12th month. Haman, wicked Haman, it seems as if Satan, I can only imagine Satan rejoicing, jubilant that he's going to kill the Jews. That means Messiah can't come. Satan will win. So Queen Esther fortified by the building up of her relative Mordecai, goes to the king. Remember in this, she said, or the book says, if you're not invited into the king's presence, if he refuses to see you, you die. It's a death penalty for approaching the king when you haven't been summoned in the Persian Empire. That's what took all of her courage. She had to gain the courage to go before the king and say, if I perish, I perish. So she goes before the king, and the Queen Esther here, it says, replied, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, because he accepts her, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me as my petition. What do I want? I want to live. That's all I want. I want the right to live, the freedom to live. Let my life be given me as my petition, and my people as my request, all of the Jews in your land. For we have been sold, and I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. So now the king realizes, I've married a Jew. What would the king have done? He loved Esther. He chose her from all the women in the empire that were brought to him. What would the king do? What would he have done if he would have known that Haman, when he came to him with this plan, hey, we need to kill all these people, what would he have done if he knew his beloved wife was one of those people? It's clear that the guy didn't know who he had married. Here he realizes, I've married a Jew, and I love this Jew. The very next verse, King Ahasuerus asked Queen Esther in his rage, who is he and where is he who would presume to do this? Who sold you to be killed? And Esther said, a foe and an enemy is this wicked Haman. All along, Ahasuerus thinks Haman's one of his greatest counselors. But on this day, his wife says, no, this man is wicked. It's him. He's the enemy. He's your foe. And then Haman became terrified because he was there at a banquet that Esther was throwing. Haman became terrified before the king and queen because he knew the king or the queen had the king's ear, and the king was going to be upset by someone trying to murder his wife. That's what he was trying to do. You're trying to murder the queen and all her people. But it's bad enough. You're trying to murder my wife. There's going to be consequences for that. So what do? How does God, who's not spoken of in the book, but how does God handle this? He turns the tide in perfect retributive justice. You want to do this to me? I'll do it to you. You want to do this to my people? I'll do it to you. And in Esther 7 verse 10 it says, so they hanged Haman on the gallows which he had prepared for Mordecai. Perfect justice. You want to hang an innocent Jew? I'll hang you. It's just the way he does, isn't it? Perfect justice. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. It's the same story in the times of Pharaoh. When Pharaoh wanted to drown all the Egyptian boys in the water, he told the Jewish midwives, if it's born a son, drown it. So how does God respond to that? You want to kill my Jewish sons? You want to drown my Jewish boys? How does God respond to that? Perfectly. An eye for an eye. Where did all the Egyptian men die? In the Red Sea. How did they die? He drowned them. You see this pattern over and over in the Bible. That's why an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth is such a true thing, because God does it. You want to drown my kids? I'll drown yours. Here, you want to hang my innocent man, Mordecai, my man for the job, my man that I have chosen to build up Queen Esther so she can have the courage to go into the king? You want to kill my man on a gallows? I'll kill you on the same gallows that you built. Sometimes just, I don't know what to say, perfect justice. But it's something else, how cutting it is sometimes. So they hanged Haman on the gallows which he had prepared for Mordecai, and the king's anger subsided. Remember Genesis 12:3, I'll bless those who bless you. What's the end of it? I'll curse those who curse you. And what had Haman done? What had he done? He wanted to kill all the Jews. What does God say? Those are my people that you're trying to curse. It's going to come back on your head. Didn't take long. Esther 8, the next chapter, continuing the story. Remember, I told you when a king makes a law, when a king makes a decree in the Persian Empire, it could not be annulled. He couldn't say, oh, bad law, we're just going to strike it from the books. So what happened is Mordecai came to the king and said, let's make a new law. Let's make this law. And that's what in them refers to. In the decrees that the Jew Mordecai had brought to the king, in these decrees, the king granted the Jews who were in each and every city the right to assemble and to defend their lives, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate the entire army of any people or province which might attack them, including children and women, or Muslims from Gaza. What's changed? Including children and women, and to plunder their spoil on one day in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, the 13th day of the 12th month. So what did God do? He raises up Mordecai to issue a second set of decrees, not because you couldn't undo the first one. We will have war on the 13th day of the 12th month because your neighbors might try to kill you, but the new law is you defend yourself and kill them if you can. Let's go to war. Astounding. Can you imagine if we did things like this today? Can you imagine what our college campuses would look like today if this was the rule in the land? Astounding that this is what God chose to do. You want to annihilate and kill my Jews with the sword? A painful death in an attack? You'll die the same way. A more retributive justice, more an eye for an eye. It's not that one day the Jews woke up and all the people that wanted them dead were killed and God did it while they slept. He had them turn on each other. He is instituting war for all you pacifists. He's instituting in these decrees through King Ahasuerus warfare. Pick up arms and fight. That's our God. The next chapter. How does the story continue? The Jews assembled. It was life or death. Of course they did. The Jews assembled in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who sought their harm. No one could stand before them, for the dread of them had fallen on all the peoples. And we see this at different places, the dread of the Lord, the dread of the Israel, the God caused, Yahweh caused, the dread of the Jews to fall on the people. We hear it in many, many other wars, many other battles that take place in Israel. Here we have it. All we don't have is the Lord caused the dread of them to fall on all the peoples. But we know He did it. The pattern's identical to what it has been many, many other times in the book. Even all the princes, look who else was on the sides of the Jews because they realized this is not going to go well for us. Even all the princes of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, those who were doing the king's business, so let's call them the government. The government assisted the Jews because the dread of Mordecai had fallen on them. All of a sudden, this Mordecai is rising in authority in the Persian Empire. King Ahasuerus loves this guy. And the good politicians say, we better get on the winning side. I wonder how many of those good politicians would have killed the Jews on the 13th day of the 12th month if not for this second decree. It seems like a real convenient choice. A couple of verses later, Esther 9:5, thus the Jews struck all their enemies with the sword. So the 13th day of the 12th month comes, and they go to war. The Jews struck all the enemies with the sword, killing and destroying, and they did what they pleased to those who hated them. They did what they pleased to those who hated them. In the last verse, remember, I'll bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. The Jews struck all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying. You want to kill and destroy my people? I'll let them kill and destroy you. It's not a mean thing. It's a perfectly just thing. Maybe hard for some of you to wrap your arms around that, but that's what that is. An eye for an eye. Esther 9:22, the story ends. It says, on those days, because it wasn't enough to kill all the Jews on the 13th day of the 12th month, Esther goes back to the king and says, King, can we do this again tomorrow? We're not finished. One day was not enough to squelch our enemies. We need another day. And so the king gave another day, and on the 14th day of the 12th month, the Jews continued killing their enemies. So it's speaking here of both of those days, the 13th and the 14th. It says, on those days the Jews rid themselves of their enemies, and it was a month which was turned for them from sorrow into gladness. For months, I forget what the month was when they made the decree, but it was either the second month or the third month. They had to wait all the way until the 12th month to be killed. I mean, imagine that. Living for the next 9 months, knowing, well, how would you spend your time? If you knew you had 9 months and after 9 months you were going to be killed by your neighbor, what would you do? I mean, talk about the most desperate event ever. And the Lord steps in and says, not on my watch. You're not going to harm the Jews on this day. The Jews will live on, all 12 tribes. They will live on, and I will turn them on you. I'll give them strength. I'll bring a terror on the people, and the Jews will destroy you, because I'll curse anyone who curses my people. On those days, the Jews rid themselves. It was a month which was turned for them from sorrow, months-long sorrow, thinking they were going to die, into wonderful gladness. A month that was turned from mourning. Imagine mourning for yourself, for your spouse, for your children. The mourning, the depth of sorrow in the time, in those months. It was turned from mourning into a holiday. That they should make them days of feasting and rejoicing instead of annihilation and destruction that was purposed for the Jews. Instead of that, the Jews say, we'll celebrate these days with feasting and rejoicing and sending portions of food to one another and gifts to the poor. And this, as I started, this is what the Jews still celebrate as the Feast of Purim, P-U-R-I-M, Purim. You may say, Rick, what does the word Purim have anything to do with? Well, the Pur, the P-U-R, was the lot. In the Old Testament, you hear a lot about they cast lots for this, and the lot fell to Jacob, the lot fell to whoever. It was a way that they determined the will of God by casting lots. The Hebrew word for lot is pur, P-U-R. Purim is the plural, the casting of lots, the Purim. You put an I-M on a Hebrew word, you make it plural. And the reason that word is chosen is because that's the way Haman, the wicked Haman, decided on what day shall we kill all the Jews. That's how he decided. He cast lots. And the lot fell to the 12th month, and then the lot fell to the 13th day. And by some sort of throwing of dice and randomness, he decided, Haman, that all the Jews on earth should die on the 13th day of the 12th month by casting lots. And isn't it something, by calling this the Feast of Purim, Israel remembers how Haman cast lots for the Jews, but God completely overrode the plans of this satanically driven man, Haman, and killed all of the enemies of Israel on these 2 days. The Feast of Purim, the casting of lots. So what do we learn from the book? What do we get from the promise? Just a couple of thoughts. Yahweh protects Israel even when Israel is far from Yahweh. I call Esther and Mordecai part of the remnant. But let me go back to this slide quickly and ask you a question. Look at what it says there in 538 BC. Cyrus, king of Persia, appointed to send Jews back to the promised land. Where is Esther and where is Mordecai? Are they back in the promised land? Have they gone back? Have they made Aliyah? Are they so happy that the 70 years is up? Have they made their way back into Jerusalem, back into Israel or Jerusalem, wherever their tribe should have lived? Have they gone back into the land as wonderfully obedient Jews, or have they stayed outside the land and made a life for themselves in Susa, the capital of Persia. Well, there's the answer. They stayed outside the land. So it's interesting, that statement for me, that Israel is far from Yahweh, even geographically, he saves, even when the queen and the relative Mordecai are nowhere near the promised land. They didn't go back. They should have gone back. But God can use our bad decisions, can't he? And here we have it. Yahweh protects Israel even when Israel is far from Yahweh. Israel is to prepare for a 400-year silent period. Prophets won't speak for 400 years. Israel is to prepare for a 400-year silent period, but the remnant would learn from the story, the account of Esther, and the saving of the Jews by Yahweh. The remnant would know that Yahweh is always with Israel. Even through the silence, nothing has changed. They're the people of God, and Yahweh will always be with the people of God. Have confidence. The majority of you may be far from me, but those of you who are close will be as close and intimate as you've ever been. I'm not going anywhere. I'm just going silent because your nation doesn't want me to speak to them through the prophets. And if they don't want it, I'll shut it down. Amazing, huh? The Jews, the people of God, the treasured possession. So many, many times they just said no. I'm trying to think of something happy to say. They will be restored one day. There will be a time, according to the promises of God in the Bible, that the Jews will be restored to a proper relationship with God. But it, again, will take an act of God to get them to that restored period. When God decides to take their heart of stone out of them and put in a heart of flesh, to write on their hearts the words of the law so that they will never disobey the law again, has to be an act of God again to bring the Jews back into perfect restoration with Him. But they will be restored one day. I'm the Lord God, I do not change. It's because of this, Jacob, that you're not consumed. It's because my character doesn't change. My promises are eternal. I love Israel. I'll always stand by her. The Word of God. Let's close in prayer. Father,